There's a moment in every person's life when they sit quietly with themselves and realize that peace is not something the world gives you, it's something you protect. And the strange thing is, sometimes the biggest threats to your peace are not strangers, not co-workers, not people online, but the people who share your blood, your childhood, your home. We grow up believing that family is sacred, family is safe, family is unconditional. But life teaches you a difficult truth. Not everyone who is connected to you deserves access to your mind, your emotions, or your future. And the courage to accept this truth is what sets you free. I've learned that some of the deepest wounds don't come from enemies. They come from the hands we expected to hold us, the voices we expected to support us. But loving someone doesn't mean you must tolerate everything they do. Respect is not guaranteed by titles. Peace is not guaranteed by DNA. And boundaries are not an act of rebellion, they're an act of survival. You don't become cold when you protect your mental health. You become clear. You don't become selfish when you say no. You become sane. And you don't break the family bond when you stop tolerating toxic behavior. You break the cycle. As you listen to this episode, I want you to keep one idea close. Your life is shaped far more by what you refuse to allow than by what you accept. And the moment you stop justifying harmful behavior is the moment you start healing. Today, we're diving into 10 toxic behaviors you should never tolerate, no matter who they come from. Each one of them is something many people silently suffer through because they were taught that family comes first. But the truth is simple. Your well-being comes first, or nothing else will. If this episode resonates with you, take a second to like it and subscribe. Now let's begin. 1. Emotional manipulation. There's a certain kind of pain that doesn't show on the surface. It doesn't bruise the skin, it bruises the self. And emotional manipulation is exactly that kind of wound. Subtle enough to confuse you, deep enough to reshape the way you see yourself. It often begins quietly. A comment here, a guilt-laden sigh there, a sudden silence used like a weapon. Before you even realize what's happening, you start questioning your own feelings, doubting your own instincts, apologizing for things you didn't do. And the saddest part, it usually comes from someone you once trusted to protect you, not twist you. Manipulation in a family setting hits harder because you grow up believing that love is supposed to feel safe. So when someone uses fear, guilt, or emotional withdrawal to control you, your mind doesn't see danger. It sees confusion. You tell yourself, maybe I'm overreacting, or maybe they're right. Maybe it is my fault. You shrink a little every time you bend to keep the peace, and slowly the version of you that knows the truth becomes quieter, dimmer, more hesitant. I've realized something about manipulators. They don't want clarity, they want control. They don't want understanding, they want power. They don't want conversation, they want you to surrender first so they don't have to. And once you learn to see the pattern, you can't unsee it. The guilt trips, the cold shoulder, the sudden kindness when they want something. The emotional storms that appear only when you start standing up for yourself. They script the entire dynamic to make you feel responsible for their emotions, while never acknowledging yours. And here's the question I want you to sit with. How many of your decisions were actually yours? And how many were made out of fear of someone's reaction? If the answer scares you, that's a sign, not of weakness, but of awakening. If you've ever walked on eggshells around someone, if you've ever felt like your peace depends on someone else's mood, if you've ever apologized just to make the tension disappear, you've tasted the quiet poison of emotional manipulation. And the truth is, once it becomes a pattern, it never stops on its own. Manipulators don't suddenly wake up with accountability. They stop only when the person they're feeding on steps out of the cycle. So here's the shift, the simple but difficult one. If they use guilt to control you, detach from the guilt. If they use silence to punish you, fill the silence with your own calm. If they escalate emotions to overpower you, don't match the intensity. Match your values. When you stop reacting to their tactics, the power dynamic collapses. They lose the script, and you reclaim your clarity. If this is showing up in your life, then it. If someone uses guilt, fear, or silence to control me, then I choose to pause, breathe, and respond from truth, not pressure. And as you practice this, something shifts inside you. Your sense of self returns, your boundaries strengthen, your emotional world becomes your own again. And maybe this is how real freedom begins. 2. Constant disrespect. There's a moment, and maybe you've felt it, when someone close to you says something small, something harmless, and it lands deeper than they think, a sarcastic jab, a dismissive shrug, a laugh at your ideas, a tone that makes you feel small, even if there are no insults in the sentence. Disrespect doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes dressed as humor, sometimes as advice, sometimes as "that's just how they are." But no matter the disguise, it chips away at your sense of worth, one comment at a time. What makes disrespect from family so damaging is the expectation we grow up with, the belief that these are the people who should see your value most clearly. When that belief is betrayed, it creates a strange internal conflict. Part of you wants to speak up, and another part whispers, "Don't cause trouble. They didn't mean it, just let it go." And over time, the accumulation of all the things you let go becomes a quiet graveyard of self-esteem. Let's be honest, you can love someone and still feel the sting of their careless words. You can appreciate them and still feel unseen. And many people stay silent because they've been conditioned to believe that family disrespect is normal, that it's just cultural, generational, or their personality. But disrespect is not personality, it's behavior, and behavior can be chosen or changed. What's fascinating is how the body responds long before the mind accepts the truth. You feel your shoulders tense when they walk into the room. Your smile becomes tighter. You rehearse your sentences to avoid being mocked. You shrink yourself so they don't have something to comment on. And if you've ever walked away from a conversation thinking, "Why did that bother me so much?" It's because disrespect wounds the part of you that still hopes to be understood. Here's the reflective question I want to place in front of you now. If a stranger treated you the way this person does, would you tolerate it for even 5 minutes? If the answer is no, then why does a shared last name give them permission to cross boundaries that would never be acceptable anywhere else? And I know, confronting this is scary, because the moment you decide to stop tolerating disrespect, people who benefit from your silence will frame your self-respect as a problem. They'll call you dramatic, sensitive, ungrateful, difficult. But the truth is, they're losing access to a version of you who had no boundaries, and they don't know how to deal with the new one who does. So here's your if-then for this point. A grounding shift you can carry forward. If someone, even family, speaks to me in a way that attacks my dignity, then I choose to pause, name the behavior clearly, and refuse to internalize their tone as a reflection of my worth. This doesn't mean you escalate. It doesn't mean you start a battle. It means you stand in the quiet power of someone who knows they deserve basic respect. And something transforms when you do. Your voice steadies, your presence strengthens, and you stop abandoning yourself to maintain an illusion of harmony, because real harmony doesn't come from silencing your pain. It comes from honoring your value, even when others don't. And maybe that's where your healing begins. 3. Boundary violations. There's a certain kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from working too hard or from life pushing you around. It comes from people stepping into places inside you where they were never invited. And what makes it harder to recognize is that boundary violations often come from the people you love the most. Not because they're villains, but because they believe access to your life is their right, not a privilege. When someone repeatedly crosses your boundaries, it doesn't always happen in dramatic ways. Sometimes it begins with small intrusions. Someone reading your messages just to check something. Someone giving opinions you never asked for about your relationships, your career, your choices. Someone entering your room, your space, or your inner world without knocking, literally or emotionally. And it becomes so normalized that you start questioning whether you're allowed to want space, privacy, or autonomy at all. Family can be the hardest to set boundaries with because many cultures teach us that family knows best, or family is everything, or you shouldn't say no to your parents, your siblings, your relatives. But the truth is quieter and more real. Love without respect quickly turns into possession, and possession is not love. I've learned that people who violate boundaries do so for many reasons. Some genuinely don't realize what they're doing because no one has ever challenged them. Some believe their role gives them permission, parent, sibling, elder, as if age or history justifies crossing lines. And some know exactly what they're doing, but count on your hesitation, your politeness, or your fear of conflict to keep the door open for them. Whatever the reason, the impact on you is the same. You lose pieces of yourself each time you betray your inner no to keep the peace. What makes boundary violations so draining is that they pull you into a role you never asked for, the role of constant emotional manager. You start anticipating their reactions before they speak. You adjust your life to avoid upsetting them. You hide parts of yourself to stay safe. And suddenly, your life stops being yours and becomes a negotiation you never agreed to. Some people cross boundaries through over-involvement, commenting on your weight, your appearance, your spending, your friends, your partner. Others do it through emotional intrusion, demanding explanations, expecting access to your private thoughts, insisting on knowing details that are none of their concern. And then there are those who violate boundaries through pressure, expecting you to sacrifice your plans, your rest, your mental health, simply because family comes first. But here's the uncomfortable truth. If honoring your own boundaries feels like betrayal, that's a sign you were raised to believe your needs are less important than other people's expectations. So let me ask you something, and answer it honestly in the space of your mind. How much of your life is truly your choice? And how much is shaped by the fear of disappointing someone who won't respect your boundaries? If that question stings, it's because you're waking up to the truth. And waking up is the first step toward reclaiming your life. You're not wrong for wanting privacy. You're not wrong for needing emotional space. You're not wrong for saying, "This is not okay with me." Boundaries are not walls, they're doors, and doors have locks for a reason. Healthy people knock. Toxic people try to push their way in. And the moment you start protecting your inner world, those who relied on your lack of boundaries will begin calling you selfish, cold, or changed. But what they're really saying is, You stopped letting me take advantage of you. When you start enforcing boundaries, you don't become distant. You become defined. People know where you end and they begin. They know what behavior is welcome and what behavior is not. They know the cost of access, respect. And this isn't about creating fights or walls, it's about creating clarity. Boundaries don't eliminate love, they purify it. They remove resentment. They save relationships that can be saved and expose the ones that cannot. A person who loves you may not always like your boundary, but they will adjust. A person who wants control will punish you for having one. So here's your if-then shift, the kind that slowly rewires your life. If someone repeatedly crosses a boundary I've clearly expressed, then I choose to restate it once, enforce it calmly, and refuse to sacrifice myself to protect their comfort. You don't need to shout. You don't need to explain your reasons 100 times. You don't need to justify your right to be a person with emotional walls. Calm firmness is more powerful than emotional battles. And as you practice this, you begin to reclaim something you may have forgotten: the right to be whole, unpressured, and fully yourself. Boundaries reveal the truth of relationships, and sometimes the truth is uncomfortable, but it's always freeing. And maybe this is the moment you start creating the kind of life where your peace is not negotiable. 4. Envy, disguised as advice. There's a very specific kind of pain that you don't notice at first. It doesn't come from an insult or a fight or an obvious attack. It comes from someone looking at your dream, your growth, your small steps forward, and responding with a smile that doesn't quite reach their eyes. At first, you think they're trying to help. Their words sound like concern, like guidance, like protection, but something feels off. Their advice leaves you feeling smaller, not stronger, confused, not clarified, doubtful, not encouraged. And eventually you realize this isn't advice. This is envy wearing the mask of wisdom. It's surprising how often this happens in families. You expect support. You expect love. You expect someone to be happy for you. But envy is an old emotion, older than logic, older than language. And when someone close to you hasn't dealt with their own regrets, their own failures, or their own unfulfilled potential, your growth becomes a mirror they can't look into without pain. Instead of facing their reflection, they try to dim your light. And envy rarely walks in directly. It's too subtle for that. It arrives in lines like, "Are you sure this is a good idea? I just don't want to see you get disappointed." People fail at this all the time. "You're dreaming too big. Be realistic. I'm saying this because I care." But caring doesn't shrink someone. Caring doesn't plant fear in the soil of your ambition. Caring doesn't take your excitement and replace it with hesitation. When someone consistently wraps negativity in the packaging of advice, what they're really doing is protecting themselves from the discomfort of watching you become something they chose not to be. And maybe the most painful part is that they don't always know what they're doing. Some people unconsciously sabotage you because they've never been allowed to believe in themselves. Some do it because they fear losing you. Some do it because everyone around them taught them that playing small is safe. And some, the truly toxic ones, do it because your growth disrupts the hierarchy that gave them power. There's something deeply human in wanting the approval of the people you love. It's almost instinctual. So when their advice cuts your confidence, you start to internalize it. You second-guess your idea. You delay your plans. You quiet your dreams. And little by little, you begin to live a smaller version of the life you originally envisioned. Not because you failed, but because someone else's fear became louder than your courage. So pause with me for a second and ask yourself, how many dreams have you put on hold because someone you loved convinced you to doubt yourself? When you answer that honestly, you might feel something shift, something wake up, and that awakening is the beginning of reclaiming your choices. Envy, disguised as advice, often shows up at very specific moments. The moment you start healing, the moment you start earning more, the moment you meet someone who treats you better, the moment you grow emotionally, spiritually, financially. Growth activates envy in the people who never believed their own growth was possible. You'll notice patterns. They bring up failures whenever you talk about possibilities. They highlight risks, but never solutions. They encourage stability when what they really mean is, don't outgrow the life I stayed in. They give you reasons to wait, postpone, settle, and when you succeed anyway, they minimize it. Anyone could have done that. You got lucky. It's not a big deal. But envy cannot stop a determined person. It can only distract them. And here's the part many people struggle with. It doesn't matter if the envy comes from a parent, a sibling, a cousin, or someone who raised you. The relationship title does not change the emotional truth. If someone consistently discourages your growth, that is not love in action. Love may not always understand your dream, but it never tries to shrink it. What's powerful is how your life changes when you stop mistaking envy for wisdom. You stop asking the wrong people for permission. You stop shrinking your ideas to protect their comfort. You stop editing your passion to avoid their reactions. And suddenly, your inner voice becomes clearer, louder than their fear, stronger than their doubts. So here's your if-then shift for this point, a kind of inner compass to return to when someone tries to dim your vision. If someone responds to my dreams with discouragement disguised as concern, then I choose to evaluate their pattern, not their words, and give my energy only to people who want to see me rise. When you live by this, something beautiful happens. You begin surrounding yourself with people who clap when you win, not question why you wanted to play. You begin trusting your own judgment. You begin seeking wisdom from those who have built something, not those who fear anything new. And the emotional fog created by envy starts to dissolve. What remains is clarity. And maybe that's how you finally give yourself permission to grow without apology. 5. Blame shifting and never taking accountability. There's a particular heaviness that settles in your chest when you're constantly blamed for things you didn't do. It's the weight of carrying emotions that aren't yours, the weight of being made responsible for mistakes you never made, the weight of living with someone who refuses, absolutely refuses, to look in the mirror. Blame shifting is one of the most draining, toxic behaviors you can face, especially when it comes from family. Because when the people who should share the load start placing everything on your back, your spirit bends in ways it was never meant to. It usually starts small. A parent snaps at you because they're stressed, and somehow you're the reason. A sibling refuses to acknowledge their mistake, and you're the one who should have known better. A relative hurts you, and you're told to stop being sensitive. The pattern is subtle, but the effect is profound. You begin to wonder if maybe you are the problem. You begin to apologize automatically, even when you haven't done anything wrong. You begin to absorb emotional burdens that were never yours to hold. People who never take accountability have one consistent trait. They rewrite reality so that they never have to experience discomfort. For them, apologies are dangerous. Responsibility feels like exposure. Owning their actions threatens the fragile identity they've built, an identity that depends on always being right, always being the victim, always being above correction. And in families, this shows up in painful ways. They may lash out when frustrated, then later act like it never happened. They may guilt trip you when you bring up a hurt, making the entire situation about your tone, your timing, your reaction. Anything except their behavior. They might twist your words, distort events, or shift the focus onto your mistakes from 5 years ago, just to avoid acknowledging what they did yesterday. It's a cycle that leaves you feeling unheard, unseen, and emotionally drained. The cruel irony is that people who refuse to take accountability often expect you to take all of it. They're quick to point out your flaws, your missteps, your imperfections, while they remain blind to their own. And when you finally stand your ground, they respond with shock, as if your courage to confront them is the real offense. But here's something important, something liberating. Someone else's inability to own their behavior does not make you responsible for it. You cannot fix someone who is committed to being blameless. You cannot heal someone who refuses to acknowledge the wound. You cannot reason with someone who edits the truth to protect their ego. And the more you try, the more drained you become. There's a psychological pattern behind this. People who blame shift often grew up in environments where accountability was punished. Maybe they were never allowed to admit mistakes. Maybe they were shamed every time they failed. Maybe vulnerability felt dangerous. But understanding their past does not mean you must endure their behavior. Compassion is not meant to be a prison. What makes blame shifting especially toxic is how it affects your identity over time. You start questioning your memory, your intentions, even your sanity. You replay arguments in your head, trying to understand how the conversation changed direction so fast. You walk into discussions feeling confident and walk out feeling guilty. You internalize their narrative until it feels like truth. So, let me ask you something. Answer honestly, without overthinking. How many times have you apologized just to keep the peace, even though you were the one who was hurt? If that question hits you, it's because you're waking up to something you may have ignored for years. Peace built on self-betrayal is not peace, it's silence. And silence protects the wrong person. When dealing with someone who never takes responsibility, clarity becomes your shield. You stop getting lost in emotional debates. You stop explaining yourself to someone who has no intention of listening. You stop offering softness to someone who uses it as an escape route. You start grounding yourself in what you know happened. You start naming the behavior accurately. You're shifting the blame. That's not what I said. I'm not responsible for your actions. You start holding on to facts instead of emotions. And slowly, their manipulation loses power because you stop participating in the dance. When you stop absorbing blame, two things happen. They lose the comfort of hiding behind you, and you regain the strength of standing with yourself. Believe me, that shift changes everything. So here's your if-then instruction, a stabilizing anchor for moments when someone tries to drag you into their emotional mess. If someone refuses to take accountability and tries to shift blame onto me, then I choose to stay grounded in the truth, refuse to internalize their narrative, and step back from any conversation that twists reality. You don't need their agreement to validate your truth. You don't need their acknowledgement to reclaim your peace. And you don't need to sacrifice your well-being to protect their ego. Accountability is the foundation of healthy relationships, and when someone refuses to stand on that foundation, you're not obligated to stay in the collapsing building with them. Step out, breathe, rebuild yourself in a space where honesty is not a threat, but a strength. And maybe this is where you stop carrying burdens that were never yours and finally walk lighter into the next chapter of your life. 6. Emotional neglect. There's a loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being surrounded by people who only notice you when you're useful. Emotional neglect is one of the most invisible forms of pain because nothing dramatic happens. There are no fights, no insults, no loud explosions, just absence, quiet, consistent, and heavy. And when this absence comes from family, it shapes the way you see yourself in ways you don't immediately understand. You grow up believing that love should feel like warmth, attention, support, presence. But emotional neglect teaches you something else. That you must earn love, that your needs are too heavy, that being seen is a luxury, not a right. You learn to shrink your emotions because no one ever asked about them. You learn to be strong too early because no one ever stayed long enough to let you fall apart. You learn to silence your own needs because the people who should have cared were always too busy, too distracted, too self-involved to notice. The thing about emotional neglect is that it doesn't create scars. It creates emptiness. And emptiness is much harder to recognize, harder to explain, harder to heal. You find yourself giving too much in relationships because you were trained to believe that love is something you must earn with effort, loyalty, sacrifice. You become hyper-independent, carrying everything alone, because you learned early that leaning on others leads to disappointment. And the saddest part is that you often feel guilty for wanting something as simple as emotional presence. Some families provide everything except the one thing you needed most: connection. They give food, shelter, advice, money, but never ask how your heart is doing. They show up for celebrations but disappear during your silent battles. They remember your achievements but forget your struggles, and you start to live with a strange contradiction, surrounded yet unseen. People often confuse emotional neglect with indifference, but they're not the same. Indifference is a lack of interest. Emotional neglect is a lack of response. A pattern of not showing up emotionally when it matters. A parent can love their child deeply and still neglect their emotional world. A sibling can care about you and still never ask how you're really doing. A family can function, interact, laugh, celebrate, and still fail to connect at the level where healing happens. When emotional neglect becomes normal, you develop coping mechanisms you don't even notice. You stop sharing your feelings because you learned they go nowhere. You downplay your pain to avoid feeling dramatic. You become the listener, the fixer, the strong one, not because it's who you are, but because nobody ever stepped into that role for you, and over time, you forget that you too have emotional needs that deserve attention. What's painful is the realization that some people only show up when they need something: advice, comfort, money, reassurance, and disappear when it's your turn. They depend on your strength, but never offer theirs. They call you when they're broken, but vanish when you are. And the moment you need support, they say, "You'll be fine," not out of faith in you, but out of habit, the habit of not showing up. Let me ask you something, and answer it honestly, privately, without judgment. How many times in your life have you comforted yourself because no one else was there to do it? If the answer is too many, then you already know the truth. Emotional neglect isn't just an experience. It becomes a pattern inside you, a pattern that affects relationships, confidence, vulnerability, and even the way you accept love. Because when you were trained to survive without emotional support, receiving it later in life can feel unfamiliar, uncomfortable, even undeserved. But there is a quiet power that emerges when you finally recognize emotional neglect for what it is. You stop blaming yourself for feeling disconnected. You stop thinking something is wrong with you. You stop believing that your emotions are burdens. You start understanding that you were conditioned to expect too little from the people who should have given you the most. And healing begins with one simple shift: choosing presence for yourself, asking yourself the questions you were never asked, offering yourself the validation you sought for years, learning to be emotionally available to your own experiences. And slowly, you begin to break the cycle. You begin to reshape the kind of relationships you accept. You begin to require what you never received. So here's your if-then instruction, a grounding truth to carry with you as you heal this part of your story. If someone consistently shows up only when they need something but disappears when I do, then I choose to stop offering them emotional access that is not mutual and redirect that energy into people and spaces where presence flows both ways. You don't need to cut everyone off. You don't need to start arguments. You simply begin honoring your own emotional reality. You recognize who is capable of showing up and who is not, and that clarity liberates you from expecting depth where there is only convenience. Emotional neglect teaches you to be strong. Healing teaches you to be supported. And maybe, just maybe, this is the moment you allow yourself to experience the kind of presence you've always given others, without apology, without guilt, without shrinking. 7. Control through money, obligation, or fear. There's a certain kind of control that doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't threaten directly. It doesn't force you physically. Instead, it wraps itself around your life through obligations, through favors, through the things you owe, through the things they did for you, through fear that's disguised as love. And because it often comes from family, it can take years, sometimes decades, to realize that what you thought was support was actually a leash. Control through money is one of the most common forms, and also one of the most denied. Someone pays your tuition, your rent, helps you during a difficult time, and instead of offering generosity, they weaponize it. Suddenly, every decision you make has to be explained. Every dream you pursue must be approved. Every boundary you try to set becomes disrespect or forgetting where you came from. And slowly, you learn that the help they gave wasn't help. It was currency, not in your hands, but around your neck. Other people control through obligation. They bring up everything they've ever done for you, recounting it like a list of debts you will never finish paying. They remind you of sacrifices you never asked for. They use phrases like, "After everything I've done," or "You're all I have," or "Family doesn't say no." And when you try to create space for your own life, your own choices, your own identity, they make you feel guilty for wanting independence. You begin to live a life that's not yours, a life shaped by pressure instead of purpose. And then there's fear, not loud fear, not physical fear, but emotional fear. The fear of disappointing someone, of being punished with silence, of being shamed for your choices, of becoming the bad one, the selfish one, the ungrateful one. Some families don't need to raise a hand to control you. They only need to raise their tone, their silence, their disappointment. That alone becomes enough to make you abandon your own needs. What makes this kind of control so toxic and so effective is that it disguises itself as care. People who control you through money will say they're just helping. People who control through obligation will say they're just reminding you of your roots. And people who control through fear will say they're just protecting you from mistakes. They use soft words to hide harsh truth. They blur the line between love and control until you can't tell the difference. But if it were care, it wouldn't demand obedience. If it were love, It wouldn't require your sacrifice in exchange. If it were support, it wouldn't punish your independence. True support gives you wings. Toxic support gives you handcuffs. The hardest part is admitting that control doesn't always look like domination. Sometimes it looks like help with strings attached. Sometimes it looks like expectations that suffocate your growth. Sometimes it looks like unspoken pressure that forces you to choose between your life and someone else's comfort. And you start to adjust your behavior without realizing it. You stop making certain choices out of fear of their reaction. You turn down opportunities because they might disapprove. You hide your accomplishments because they might feel threatened. You stay small because stepping into your real life means stepping out of their shadow, and they don't want that. Let me ask you something, gently but directly. How much of your life right now is shaped by someone else's expectations, not your own honest desires? When that question hits, it's because you're confronting a truth you may have avoided for a long time. Control often feels like safety until you finally taste freedom. You are not obligated to dim your life because someone helped you once. You are not responsible for carrying someone's emotional weight just because you share blood. You are not required to sacrifice your mental health to fulfill someone's idea of family duty. And you certainly are not required to live under someone else's fear when your future demands courage. Breaking free from control doesn't mean breaking connection. It simply means redefining it. It means refusing to let money be used as manipulation. It means recognizing that "you owe me" is not love, it's control. It means learning that your life is not a debt to be repaid, but a path to be lived. People who love you will help you without expecting ownership. They will support your independence, not punish it. They will celebrate your autonomy, not threaten it. They will see your growth as something beautiful, not something dangerous. And when you start reclaiming your freedom, those who relied on controlling you may react. They may get louder. They may get colder. They may guilt trip you, shame you, or accuse you of changing. But the truth is, you're not changing. You're returning to yourself. So here's your if-then instruction, a boundary for your future self. If someone uses money, obligation, or fear to control my choices, then I choose to detach emotionally from their pressure, make decisions based on my values, and refuse to let support become a weapon. This doesn't require confrontation. It requires clarity. It requires remembering that help is not ownership. It requires trusting your own path more than their fear. And slowly, step by step, the chains loosen. You begin to breathe easier. You begin to choose freely. You begin to understand that your life is your own and always should have been. And maybe, in that newfound freedom, you'll discover the strength to face the next toxic pattern that often follows control. The kind where someone always paints themselves as the victim to keep you from seeing the truth. 8. Chronic victim mentality. There's a fatigue that doesn't come from physical tiredness. It comes from dealing with someone who turns every moment, every disagreement, every consequence, every responsibility into a story where they are the injured party, a chronic victim. Someone who always finds a way to make themselves the one who has been wronged, no matter the situation. And when this pattern exists within a family, it becomes one of the most suffocating emotional traps you can experience. A person with chronic victim mentality doesn't just avoid accountability. They reshape the entire narrative so that nothing is ever their fault. They use selective memory, emotional theatrics, exaggerated helplessness, and sometimes even tears to remain in the position that protects them from one thing they cannot face, their own choices. And what's worse is how this dynamic impacts the people around them, especially the ones who care. If you were raised around someone who always played the victim, you probably learned early that your feelings don't matter unless they fit their story. You learned to minimize your pain because theirs always hurt more. You learned to stay quiet during conflict because they would always twist it back onto you. You learned that expressing your needs leads to guilt, not understanding. And slowly, your world became centered around managing their emotions instead of living your own. The person who always acts like the victim rarely says, "I'm sorry." Instead, they say things like, "You made me feel this way. Look what you've done to me. I can't believe you're treating me like this. You know I'm sensitive. You're the reason I'm upset." Every sentence redirects responsibility away from them and onto you. They turn genuine conflict into a stage where they perform hurt, exaggerate pain, and manipulate the emotional atmosphere to gain sympathy and avoid accountability. And if you're empathetic, this traps you even deeper, because compassion becomes the weapon used against you. The most damaging part of this dynamic is that it slowly teaches you to doubt your own experiences. You start believing that maybe you really did overreact. Maybe you really are the problem. Maybe your needs are too much. Maybe your truth is hurtful. And the moment you begin doubting your own reality, you become easy to control, easy to silence, easy to bend. Family members with victim mentality also create instability in relationships. One day they act helpless and fragile, needing you for everything. The next day they're angry, blaming you for not doing enough, not caring enough, not sacrificing enough. And every time there's a disagreement, they suddenly become the wounded one, the martyr, the misunderstood soul, the one who gives so much and gets nothing in return. It never ends. What makes this so painful is that it keeps you emotionally stuck. You spend your energy trying to convince them of your intentions, trying to prove your love, trying to navigate their shifting moods. And in all of this emotional labor, one question begins to surface, quietly but persistently. Who is there for you while you're always taking care of them? If your answer is no one or only me, then you already know the truth. You've been living inside someone else's emotional story, not your own. A person who constantly plays the victim is not harmless. Their behavior drains your emotional energy, fractures your confidence, and creates cycles of guilt that feel impossible to escape. They use pity the way others use anger, as a form of control. Because if they can make you feel like the villain, they never have to face the truth. And here's the part many people struggle to accept. Their pain might be real, but their behavior is still toxic. You can feel compassion for their struggles while refusing to be manipulated by their patterns. You can care about them without sacrificing your emotional reality. You can understand their trauma without allowing it to become your burden. Healing from this dynamic begins with recognizing that you're allowed to have your own narrative, your own truth. Even if it doesn't fit the role they want you to play, you're allowed to say, "I'm not responsible for your emotions." You're allowed to stop explaining yourself to someone who has no intention of listening. You're allowed to walk away from conversations that twist reality into something unrecognizable. And the moment you stop participating in their victim performance, the entire dynamic begins to shift. They might escalate. They might become dramatic. They might accuse you of cruelty. But they're not reacting to your behavior. They're reacting to the loss of control. The script they've relied on for years no longer works on you, and that's where your freedom begins. Here's your if-then instruction to anchor yourself in moments when someone tries to drag you into their victim story. If someone repeatedly casts themselves as the victim to avoid responsibility, then I choose to disengage from emotional manipulation, stay grounded in my truth, and refuse to absorb blame that does not belong to me. This choice doesn't make you cruel. It makes you conscious. It protects your mental clarity. It allows you to live a life where emotional honesty matters more than emotional theatrics. And slowly, you begin freeing yourself from the silent exhaustion that comes from being someone else's emotional caretaker. And maybe, in that space of clarity, you'll finally recognize another toxic pattern that often hides behind victim mentality, the kind where anger becomes a tool for intimidation rather than expression. 9. Rage, outbursts, and intimidation. There's a silence that settles in a room right before someone explodes, a tension you can almost feel on your skin. If you grew up around unpredictable anger, you know exactly what I mean. The tightness in your chest, the way your body prepares itself even when nothing has happened yet. The fear that a single wrong word, a small mistake, or even your quiet presence might trigger an eruption. Rage, outbursts, and intimidation are some of the most destabilizing toxic behaviors a person can experience, especially when they come from someone you call family. Because unlike strangers, you can't simply walk away, or at least you didn't think you could. People often dismiss explosive anger as just their personality, just how they are, or they don't mean it. But unpredictable rage is not personality. It's an emotional weapon, a way to maintain control. A way to silence you before you even speak. A way to create fear so deep that you start adjusting your behavior in anticipation of their next storm. And the truth is, nothing shapes a person's nervous system like living with someone whose emotions are volatile. If you've lived through this, you know the drill. You monitor their tone the moment they walk into the room. You study their face, their steps, the way they breathe. You prepare yourself for impact before any impact arrives. You rehearse your words to avoid setting them off. You shrink. You silence yourself. You become careful in ways a person should never have to be. This is intimidation, even when no threats are spoken. This is emotional violence, even if no hands are raised. This is trauma, even if you learn to call it normal. The most painful part is how quickly anger becomes a pattern. You learn to carry the responsibility for their emotional explosions, even though you're not the cause. You start to believe you're the reason they're upset. That if you were better, quieter, more perfect, they wouldn't lose control. This belief doesn't happen overnight. It happens little by little, shaped by every slammed door, every raised voice, every moment when you weren't allowed to have emotions because theirs filled the entire room. Family members who rely on rage often have one thing in common: they never learned how to regulate themselves. Instead of dealing with their own pain, disappointment, or frustration, they weaponize it. Their anger becomes the shield that protects them from vulnerability. And because it works, because people around them become quiet, compliant, afraid, they keep using it. But here's the deeper truth. Explosive anger isn't strength. It's unhealed fear masquerading as dominance. A healthy person can feel anger without destroying the room. A mature person can disagree without humiliating you. Someone who loves you can express frustration without making you feel unsafe. People with toxic anger patterns often use intimidation to reset control in the household. One outburst can silence everyone for days. One explosion can erase your boundaries, your needs, your voice. And over time, you stop fighting back because you think it's safer to disappear than to stand up for yourself. You think compliance will buy you peace, But the peace bought through intimidation isn't real peace. It's survival. Let me ask you something. Quietly, honestly, with no pressure. How much of your personality today is shaped by avoiding someone else's anger? Your habits, your silence, your anxiety, your need to be easy, low maintenance, understanding. How much of it was taught by fear, not choice? When you look at this honestly, it becomes clear. The anger was never about you. It was never your fault. It was never your responsibility to manage. You were adapting, not causing. The moment you recognize this, something inside you shifts. You stop taking their explosions personally. You stop internalizing their rage as a measure of your worth. You stop responding with fear and start responding with clarity. Not confrontation, clarity. Because clarity is what frees you from emotional chaos. Here's what that looks like. You stop explaining yourself over and over. You refuse to accept blame for their emotional instability. You step back when someone uses anger to manipulate the room. You recognize that their reactions belong to them, not you. This doesn't mean you yell back. It doesn't mean you meet fire with fire. It means you stop feeding their control with your fear. And when you stop reacting, the dynamic begins to shift, because intimidation only works on people who feel intimidated. Once you reclaim your emotional space, their storm loses some of its power. Here's your if-then instruction, your internal boundary against emotional volatility. If someone uses rage, outbursts, or intimidation to control me, then I choose to remain grounded, refuse to internalize their emotional chaos, and protect my peace by disengaging from the moment until safety returns. Rage is loud, boundaries are quiet. Yet boundaries always win because they reshape the space around you. They put responsibility back where it belongs. They break the emotional pattern that has kept you small for so long. And as you strengthen this boundary, something inside you expands. Your sense of self, your confidence, your right to exist without fear. You begin to understand that love should never feel dangerous, that home should never feel like a battlefield, that your voice should never disappear under someone else's volume. And maybe, in this clarity, you'll be ready to face the deepest wound of all, the kind of love that only exists when you obey, perform, sacrifice, or shape yourself into who they want you to be. 10. Conditional love. There's a particular heartbreak that doesn't come from romantic relationships or friendships. It comes from realizing that the love you grew up with, or the love you hoped for, had conditions attached to it. Conditions about who you should be, how you should act, what you should believe, what choices were acceptable, and what parts of you needed to be hidden to stay loved. Conditional love is one of the deepest emotional wounds a person can carry, because it confuses the very thing you're supposed to trust the most. The idea that you deserve love simply because you exist. When love becomes conditional, it doesn't always show itself through clear rules or explicit demands. Often, it's subtle. You receive warmth only when you perform, approval only when you comply, affection only when you obey. The moment you step out of line, the love evaporates, replaced with distance, disappointment, or withdrawal. You learn quickly which version of you is acceptable and which